The emergency klaxon on observation deck 7 had been silent for 11 years, long enough that most of the crew had stopped checking whether the speaker still worked. Marcus Delray checked it every morning anyway. It was a habit left over from his first posting, when a faulty sensor had given them 6 minutes of warning before a micrometeorite cluster punched through the hull of the ISV Meridian and killed 3 people he'd eaten breakfast with that day. 6 minutes. He had learned that warning systems were only as good as the person paying attention to them, so he paid attention. Every morning, every deck, every speaker. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee when the klaxon screamed. He was already moving before the sound finished echoing. That was the other thing he'd learned from the Meridian. You didn't wait to understand what was happening. You moved, and you figured it out on the way. Deck 7's observation bay wrapped around the outer hull of the Arbiter station like a glass bracelet, a full 360-degree viewport that let diplomatic staff watch the surrounding space as they worked. It was a nice idea, architecturally. A gesture of openness, of transparency, meant to imply that the station had nothing to hide and nowhere to look except outward. In practice, it meant that when something went wrong on the exterior of the hull, anyone standing at those viewports got a front row seat to exactly how wrong it was. Marcus reached the observation bay and saw it immediately. The Veil 3 shuttle, the small diplomatic transport that had ferried Her Majesty Queen Serevel Key Dorn and her retinue up from the planet's surface 3 hours ago, had developed a catastrophic seal failure in its primary airlock housing. He could see it from here, a slow, ugly spiral of crystallized atmosphere venting from the upper port side, backlit by the planet below. The shuttle had been docked at external platform 9C past tense. The blast from the seal failure had sheared off one of the magnetic clamps, and the shuttle was rotating now, sluggishly, listing toward the station's outer hull like a drunk leaning into a wall. That was bad. The worst thing was the small figure falling away from the shuttle's ruptured cargo port. Marcus stared for exactly 1 second. His brain ran the math without asking his permission. Small body, no tether, no suit he could see from this distance, tumbling in a slow counterclockwise spin away from the station's gravity field. The shuttle's emergency systems would take 40 seconds minimum to register the separation and another 20 to fire retrieval protocols. 60 seconds minimum. The figure was already 30 meters out and accelerating. He was in the EVA prep locker before he finished the thought. The station's EVA protocol required sign-off from the safety officer, a 15-point pre-flight checklist, and buddy verification. Marcus did none of these things. He sealed his gloves, snapped his helmet, hit the compressed air check with one hand while the other was already cycling the inner airlock door, and he was in the chamber before the light above the door had finished turning red. The outer lock hissed open. He grabbed the retrieval line from the emergency bracket, clipped it to his belt ring, and stepped off the deck. Space was quiet. It was always quiet in a way that the observation deck didn't quite capture, a quiet that pressed against you, that had weight to it, that felt less like silence and more like an enormous held breath. Marcus had done 46 EVA operations over 12 years of deep space postings. The quiet still hit him the same way every time, a kind of reckoning. A reminder of what the universe actually was when you stripped away all the stations and the ships and the klaxons. He fired his suit thrusters and pointed himself at the falling figure. The retrieval line paid out behind him. He had 300 meters of it. He hoped he didn't need more than half. Closer now. He could see that the figure was small, very small. A child. Veil 3 he could tell from the body shape, the slight elongation of the limbs, the bioluminescent skin markings that pulsed in slow, irregular waves even now, even unconscious or in shock. The Veil 3 markings were like a second nervous system laid just beneath the surface of their skin, responsive to emotional state, to temperature, to fear. The child's markings were doing something Marcus had never seen before. They were flickering in a rapid, asymmetric pattern, like a candle in a high wind. He didn't know what that meant in Veil 3 physiology. He knew it couldn't be good. He fired his thrusters again and closed the last 10 meters. The child was a girl, he thought, though he was uncertain. Veil 3 gender presentation was subtle to human eyes, and he'd been briefed on it only superficially before the diplomatic summit. She was young, maybe 8 or 9 years in their reckoning, which someone had told him was roughly equivalent to 11 or 12 in human terms. She was wearing a ceremonial garment, not a pressure suit, layers of deep blue fabric with silver threading that caught the starlight, completely, absolutely unsuited for vacuum exposure. The fabric had sealed somewhat from the cold. He realized Veil 3 ceremonial garments were apparently designed with a secondary layer that could trap atmosphere for a short period, a holdover from some ancient environmental tradition. It was buying her minutes, maybe not many. He got his arms around her from behind, pulling her against his chest, and fired his thrusters hard to arrest her outward momentum. The line went taut with a jolt that he felt in his back teeth. Then he was reeling them in, hand over hand on the retrieval line, pulling them both back toward the station at a pace that felt agonizingly slow. He was aware, distantly, that his comm was going insane in his ear. He could hear multiple voices, station personnel, he thought, possibly Veil 3 translators, all speaking at once. He reached down and turned the volume to 0. He needed to focus on the line. The station's hull came up large around him. The inner airlock, the chamber pressure cycling. He had the girl against him the whole time, one arm across her chest, feeling her breathe. She was breathing, short and shallow but continuous, as the outer door sealed and the inner door opened and warm, pressurized station air flooded in around them. He set her down on the deck very carefully and took his helmet off. She was awake. He hadn't expected that. Her eyes were open, 4 of them, arranged in the Veil 3 pattern, 2 primary and 2 secondary lower, all fixed on him with an expression that he couldn't immediately name. Not fear exactly. Not gratitude, which he also wouldn't have expected from a child in shock. Something else. Evaluation, maybe. Assessment. Like she was running the same instinctive calculation he'd been running 2 minutes ago, except hers was, "What is this creature, and what does it want with me?" "You're okay," he said. He kept his voice low and even the way his mother had taught him to talk around animals that were frightened. "You're inside. You have air. You're okay." She blinked, a complex movement, all 4 eyes sequencing in pairs. Her markings had slowed from their frantic flickering to something steadier, more pulsing. He took that as a good sign. There were people around him now, he realized. He could hear boots on the deck. He looked up and found the room considerably fuller than it had been. Station medical had arrived, 2 technicians in white with a mobile unit. Behind them stood people in Veil 3 diplomatic robes, and behind them, held at a distance by the press of bodies in the corridor, stood someone who was not wearing diplomatic robes and not being held at a distance by anything at all. She was tall. Veil 3 ran tall as a species, but this woman was tall even by their standards, nearly 2 meters, with a bearing that added another half meter's worth of presence on top of that. She wore deep indigo with gold, and the markings on her skin were different from the child's. Slower, deeper, organized into geometric patterns that Marcus vaguely recalled from his briefing materials as signifiers of rank. High rank. The highest rank. He got to his feet very quickly. Queen Siravel Key Dorn crossed the distance between them in 4 strides. She went straight past him, knelt on the deck beside the girl, and pressed her forehead against the child's in a gesture that needed no cultural briefing to understand. She was checking. She was making sure. Her hands moved across the girl's face and arms with a practiced precision that spoke of someone who had done emergency medical assessments before and hadn't needed a technician to tell her how. After a long moment she looked up. Her primary eyes met Marcus's. He didn't know enough about Veil 3 facial musculature to read her expression with any confidence. He knew the diplomatic files described Queen Siravel as controlled, reserved, difficult to read even for other Veilthri. He thought what he was seeing in her face right now was something those files had probably never had occasion to mention. "She is unharmed," the Queen said. Her standard was precise, accented at the consonants. "Because of you." "The suit bought her time," Marcus said. "The fabric." The fabric gave her perhaps 4 more minutes. The Queen was still looking at him. "You reached her in 3. He didn't know what to say to that. He was aware that he was still in his EVA suit, that his hair was probably standing up in several directions from the helmet, that he smelled like recycled air and adrenaline. He was also aware that he had not, technically, followed a single station protocol in the last 8 minutes, and that the station's safety officer was going to have opinions about that. "I'm Marcus Delray," he said. "I know who you are." She rose from her crouch in a single fluid motion, and Marcus had the distinct impression that she had always known who he was, that her diplomatic team had briefed her thoroughly on every human aboard the station, and that being known about was not the same as being known. "You are the station's human liaison. You attended the opening reception last night. You stood near the north wall, drank 2 glasses of water, spoke to no one, and watched the room." He blinked. "I wasn't sure of the etiquette for approaching Veilthri dignitaries without an introduction." "No," she said, "you were not sure, and so you watched." Something moved in her face that might have been the Veilthri equivalent of a smile. "That is a quality my people respect. We call it Vorsetho, patience that learns." Her daughter said something then, in Veilthri, 3 syllables, quick and precise. The Queen looked down at her. The girl was sitting up now, her back against the wall, her ceremonial garment somewhat the worse for wear. She was looking at Marcus with that same evaluative expression, and she said the 3 syllables again, more firmly this time. "She is asking your name," the Queen said. "Marcus," he said, looking at the girl. "Marcus Delray." The girl repeated it carefully. "Marcus Delray." Her secondary eyes narrowed in what he'd been told was a Veilthri expression of concentration. Then she said something else longer. "She says," the Queen translated, her voice carrying a quality he couldn't name, "that you jumped after her without a suit. She says that is either very brave or very stupid, and she has not yet decided which." "Probably both," Marcus said. The girl's markings lit up briefly in a warm amber pattern that spread from her collarbone outward. The Queen made a sound low in her throat, not quite a laugh, but a near relation of one. "Her name is Laren," the Queen said. "She is my heir." Her heir. Of course she was. Of course Marcus Delray, who had come to Arbiter Station as a second-tier diplomatic liaison with a specialty in trade protocol, had jumped out of an airlock after the heir to the Veilthri sovereignty. Of course. "Is she?" He glanced at the medical team, who were hovering at a respectful distance. "Should she be checked by?" "She will be examined," the Queen said. "But first," she paused, it was a deliberate pause measured, "I would speak with you after she is settled." "Of course, Your Majesty." "Not here," she said. "Not with the diplomatic staff." Another pause. "I am told there is a place on this station where humans go to think. A small room near the aft observation bay with a window that faces away from the planet." He stared at her. That was the break room for Deck 9 maintenance crew. It was about as far from diplomatic appropriate as it was possible to get on the station, short of the waste processing level. It also had the best unobstructed view of deep space on the whole station, and it was the only room aboard that didn't have monitoring equipment, because no one had ever thought it was important enough to monitor. Someone had done their research very thoroughly. "I know the room," he said. "Good." She was already turning back to her daughter, her attention shifting with the completeness of someone who never half did anything. 2 hours. He watched her go. He became aware, as she disappeared through the corridor, that every member of both the Veil 3 diplomatic team and the station staff who had gathered in the airlock antechamber was looking at him. He became aware that the station's safety officer, Lieutenant Kara Ibsen, was standing directly behind him and had apparently been standing there for some time. "You bypassed a 15-point checklist," Ibsen said. "I know. You didn't have buddy verification. I know. You could have been killed. I know, Kara." A long pause. He could feel her working out what to say about that. He'd known Kara Ibsen for 3 years. She was precise, methodical, deeply committed to the protocols she enforced, and she was also the woman who had once climbed through a maintenance shaft for 2 hours in 0G to retrieve a trapped crew member's wedding ring after they'd been evacuated. "Next time," she said, "try to get the checklist done first." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked away, muttering something about EVA response protocols that he chose not to fully parse. He went to change out of his suit. The maintenance break room on Deck 9 had 4 mismatched chairs, a coffee maker that worked only on Tuesdays for reasons no one had ever satisfactorily explained, a collection of personal items left behind by decades of crew rotations, a faded photograph of a mountain range, a child's drawing of a dog, a carved wooden fish, and the window. The window was approximately 1 meter by 2, angled slightly outward so that you could press your face against it and see not the planet, not the station's own hull, but just stars. Just the pure, unmediated dark. Queen Siravel was already there when he arrived. She was standing at the window, her back to him, and she had changed from her formal diplomatic attire into something simpler, still Veil 3, still clearly expensive, but without the rank markers, without the gold. The geometric markings on her skin moved slowly, like deep-water currents. "You wanted to speak privately," he said, "because someone had to start." "Yes." She did not turn immediately. "Laren is well. The Veil 3 physician confirmed no lasting damage. She will be uncomfortable for a day. She is already arguing with the physician about whether she is required to rest, which I am told is a reliable sign of recovery." "That's good," he said. "Yes." Now she turned. She crossed the small room in 2 steps and stood at the window beside him, looking out at the dark. This close, he could see the markings on her face more clearly, the slow, geometric patterns of rank, but beneath them, fainter, an older pattern, something that had been there longer. "I need to ask you something, Marcus Delray." She used his full name the same way Laren had, both syllables of each word given equal weight, like something being recorded rather than spoken. "You can ask," he said. "You did not know who she was," the Queen said. "When you jumped, you could not have known she was too far away, the angle was wrong, you could not have seen her rank markings. You could not have known she was my daughter. You could not have known she was the heir." "No," he said. "You saw a child falling," she said, "and you jumped." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Her markings moved. "The Veil 3 diplomatic team has cataloged several humans on this station who would have responded differently had they known who she was," she said. "Who would have weighed the diplomatic ramifications, the political value, the leverage a rescue might provide." A pause. "You did not have that information. You acted before calculation was possible." "There wasn't time for calculation," he said. "There is always time for calculation," she said. "Humans calculate, Delray. You are exceptional calculators. Your species' entire history of survival is built on calculation, on working out odds faster than anything else in your environment, on making tools, making systems, making plans." She looked at him directly. "What you did today was not calculation. It was something else." He thought about it. He thought about the 6 minutes on the Meridian and the 3 people he'd eaten breakfast with, and the sound the hull had made when it gave way. He thought about the child's flickering markings in the dark, like a candle in high wind. "I suppose," he said, "we also do that the other thing." What do you call it? He almost said instinct and then thought better of it because that wasn't quite right either. Instinct implied something below thought, below choice. What he'd done had been a choice. It just had taken any time. We call it, he said slowly, being the kind of person who would. The Queen was quiet. Her markings ran a slow sequence he'd never seen before, something that started at her collarbone and moved outward, a pattern that wasn't geometric, wasn't the structured language of rank and formal expression. Something that moved more like water or weather. My advisors, she said after a while, are going to be very concerned about this conversation. My station commander is going to be very concerned that I'm having it, he agreed. That almost laugh again, lower this time. Yes, I imagine, she looked back at the stars. Laren will want to see you again. She is stubborn in her attachments. Her father was the same. A pause that carried something in it. He died 4 years ago. In a way that also had no time for calculation. He didn't say he was sorry, because he suspected that the Queen had heard that enough and that it had not, with time, come to mean very much. He said, "She seems like she'll be hard to argue with." "She is impossible to argue with," the Queen said. "She has been impossible to argue with since she was approximately 18 months old and decided that the ceremonial throne room was an appropriate place to sleep during formal proceedings. She slept in it twice before I stopped trying to move her." The markings on her face shifted into something warmer. She said the back of the throne was comfortable against her spine. She was correct. The throne is very well made. She evaluated the chair, Marcus said. For structural integrity. She evaluates everything, the Queen said. It is how she learns, or how she decides she trusts something. She glanced at him sideways, with a quality in it that made him think she was not entirely speaking about her daughter. She asked me what Vorsetha was, after I explained why you had stood at the north wall at the reception. She said she understood patience that learns. She said that what you did today was something different. She's right, he said, it was. She wants a word for it. He looked at the stars for a moment. At the dark that went on forever in every direction, interrupted here and there, by the faint cold fire of things that had been burning for 1 billion years before anything on his planet had learned to breathe. There was something in him that responded to that dark the same way it had responded to the klaxon, not with fear, exactly, but with the recognition of a very old truth, that the universe was enormous and mostly empty and did not care, and that the appropriate response to that was not despair, but rather a kind of stubborn, defiant insistence on caring anyway. We call it, he said, being human. She was quiet for a long time. We have a word, she said at last, very carefully, for the force that holds stars in their orbits. The Veil-3 word is Sethara. It means approximately the gravity of caring. We use it for physical phenomenon. We use it also sometimes for the force that compels action between people who should by all calculation have no connection to one another. She paused. I think, perhaps, we have been using it too narrowly. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything adequate to say. The summit resumes tomorrow, she said. There are 17 outstanding trade disputes, 2 territorial boundary questions, and a fisheries rights negotiation that has been proceeding very badly for 3 months. She turned from the window. My lead negotiator tells me that the human delegation's second-tier liaison, a person with a specialty in trade protocol, has reviewed all 17 disputes and prepared analysis that our side has not yet seen. He blinked. Yes, that's standard prep work. It's not particularly. My lead negotiator also tells me, she continued, with the precision of someone who enjoyed information and knew what it was worth, that this same person, while waiting in the observation bay during a break in proceedings yesterday, identified a boundary survey error in the attached documentation for Dispute 7 that would have invalidated the Veil-3 position on territorial precedent if it had been raised by the human delegation in session. He had found that. He'd flagged it in his notes and then spent 20 minutes deciding what to do with it, because it was the kind of thing that could be used as leverage if you were inclined toward leverage, and he had not, ultimately, been inclined. He'd sent a quiet correction to the records office. He'd thought it had probably gone unnoticed. "I corrected a filing error," he said. "You corrected a filing error that benefited our position," she said, "and you did not mention it to your own delegation." "It was a filing error. It wouldn't have been right to use it." She looked at him with all four of her primary eyes, and the markings on her face ran a pattern he had never seen before on any Veil-3, a slow, complex, synchronized movement that he would later learn, when he finally had access to a proper cultural briefing, was called the Ron Vetha, the recognition of something rare. "Marcus Delray," she said, "I would like you to be the lead human liaison for the remainder of this summit." He stared at her. "Your Majesty, I'm a second tier." "I am the Queen of the Veil-3 sovereignty," she said mildly. "I have some influence over the configuration of negotiating teams. I have already spoken with your station commander. He is, as you predicted, concerned. He is also, after some reflection, amenable." He stared at her for another moment. She stared back with the patience of someone who had run an interstellar sovereignty for 11 years and had no pressing appointments until morning. "Laren would also like you to teach her a game," the Queen added. She saw crew members playing it in the recreation hall. She described it as the game with colored circles that humans argue about. That could be several games. She said there are colored circles, and you slide them, and there is considerable disagreement about who has won. "Shuffleboard," he said. "She wants to learn shuffleboard." "She wants to learn shuffleboard," the Queen confirmed, with the air of someone who had learned long ago to approach her daughter's enthusiasms pragmatically and meet them on their own terms. "She also wants to know if you will play against her. She said, and I am quoting precisely, 'I want to see if he calculates or does the other thing.'" He laughed. He couldn't help it. It came out before he thought about it, genuine and unguarded, and he watched the Queen's face to see whether that was a diplomatic error, and found that the markings on her face had gone warm again, the same amber-edged pattern he'd seen on Laren in the airlock. "Tell her," he said, "that I'll teach her the rules. Whether I calculate or do the other thing will depend on how the game goes." "That is a very diplomatic answer," the Queen said. "I'm a liaison," he said. "It's the job." She made the almost laugh sound again, and this time it was close enough to the real thing that he filed it as a laugh, definitively, and moved on. They stood at the window for a few more minutes. Neither of them found it necessary to fill the silence. Outside, the stars burned with the patient indifference of things that had never needed to care, and did not need to care, because everything that cared was in here, in the stations and the ships, and the small rooms with mismatched chairs and broken coffee makers, where people from opposite ends of the galaxy stood next to each other and looked at the same dark. He thought about what she'd said, the gravity of caring, Sethara, the force that holds stars in their orbit. He thought that maybe the Veil-3 had always understood something that humans had been trying to articulate for 50,000 years of civilization, and had mostly managed to express only in actions. That the universe's fundamental mystery was not how large it was, or how old it was, or what it was made of, but that anything in it cared about anything else at all. That against all probability, against all the cold arithmetic of survival, some creatures had developed the capacity to look at a falling child, any child, unknown, unrelated, unconnected by any tie of blood or politics or calculation, and jump. That was the other thing. That was the thing Laren wanted a word for. He didn't think Standard quite had it. He suspected Veil-3 didn't either. He thought it might be one of those things that resisted translation, because it predated language, something that lived in the part of whatever you were that moved before your words did. "I should go," the Queen said. Laren will be awake and she will want to know every detail of our conversation. Should I be worried about that? You should be slightly worried, she said, in the way that one is slightly worried about weather that is technically not threatening but bears watching. She moved toward the door and then stopped. She looked at him over her shoulder, and her markings ran one slow, complete sequence, the Ron Vetha he would later learn, and she said, "Thank you, Marcus Delray, for being the kind of person who would." She left. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. He stood at the window for a while longer. Outside, the stars held their places with all the casual permanence of things that had never learned to be otherwise. The dark went on forever. He had jumped into it this morning with a retrieval line and no checklist and 3 minutes to work with, and somehow he had come back with something more than he'd gone in with. He thought about the summit tomorrow, about 17 trade disputes and a fisheries negotiation, and whatever else was going to need untangling. He thought about Laren, sitting up against the airlock wall with her ceremonial garment in ruins, evaluating him with 4 steady eyes, and deciding she hadn't yet made up her mind. He thought that there were worse things to do with a life than to be the kind of person worth making up your mind about. He stayed at the window until the coffee maker on the counter gave a single, inexplicable click and lit up briefly, and then went back to being silent, which meant that it was either Tuesday somewhere, or that the universe had a better sense of humor than it generally got credit for. He smiled at the dark. Then he went to find out what time shuffleboard started. The lead human negotiator, Ambassador Patricia Solano, did not take the news of her new colleague's promotion especially well. She was polite about it. She was always polite, but Marcus had been working diplomatic postings long enough to read the register of politeness. There was the politeness that meant welcome, and the politeness that meant I'm going to handle this very correctly, and then find a way to make it not happen, and the politeness that was simply the professional habit of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where displaying any other reaction was inadvisable. Solano's was the third kind. "I want to be clear," she said, sitting across from him in the small conference room she'd claimed as her working space, "that I have no objection to your involvement. You're clearly capable. The boundary survey correction was excellent work." "Thank you." "I do want to understand the context," she said, in the tone that meant the context was the objection. "You've been in a private conversation with the Veil-3 Queen, unmonitored, unchaperoned." For as she checked her notes, 38 minutes. 42, he said. "I stayed after she left." A pause. "You stayed in an unmonitored room, alone, after a private meeting with a foreign head of state." "I was looking at the stars." Another pause longer. She had the diplomat's skill of using silence as a verb. "Marcus," she said finally, which was the first time she'd used his first name, which meant they had moved from the professional register to the professional but real one. "I need to understand what's happening here." He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the queen at the window, and the word she'd practiced, company, and the child who'd spent 3 hours reading about humans before deciding to trust one with an 11-7 shuffleboard victory. "I think," he said, "that we might actually solve the trade disputes." Solano looked at him. "All 17 of them," he added. She put down her pen. He pulled out his notes, 3 days of analysis, cross-referenced against the Veil-3 filings, annotated against the cultural briefing documents he'd been working through after hours. He spread them on the table between them and started talking. He talked for 40 minutes. He laid out the disputed items, one by one, but not in the order they'd been filed, in the order of what was actually at stake for each side, which was a different order entirely, and which revealed, once you mapped it out, that 7 of the 17 disputes were symptoms of the same underlying anxiety. The Veil-3 were worried about resource access in the outer belt, and the human coalition was worried about navigational rights in Veil-3 adjacent space, and neither side had said that plainly because saying it plainly would have meant admitting how worried they were. If we address those two things, he said, directly in session, the other 10 disputes almost settle themselves. They're all downstream of the same two fears. Solana was quiet for a long time. How did you figure this out? She asked. I talked to someone who knows the Veil-3 side, he said. She looked at him, the Queen. She didn't give me anything proprietary, he said quickly. She didn't breach any confidence. It's more that I've been looking at the files trying to figure out what the Veil-3 actually want, and talking to her gave me a way to read the subtext that I didn't have before. He paused. She's very precise. When she's not saying something, she's very precisely not saying it. Solano looked at his notes again. She picked up the page on Dispute 7, the boundary survey, the one he'd corrected, and read it in detail. He watched her work through it. He watched the moment when she stopped reading defensively and started reading like someone who saw what he'd built. She put the page down. Tell me about the Veil-3 outer belt concerns, she said. They worked until 300. By the time they stopped, they had a proposed framework, not a final agreement, but a structure that could hold one. Marcus went to bed feeling the particular exhaustion of having used his brain for something it was genuinely suited for, which was different from regular tired in a way that was almost satisfying. In the morning, Laren was waiting outside the breakfast hall. She was accompanied by 2 diplomatic staff, who looked like they had lost an argument about where she was allowed to be this early. She had a data tablet under one arm and the expression of someone who had been waiting patiently, for about as long as patience was going to last. Good morning, Marcus said. You were working last night, she said. Not a greeting, a statement, filed alongside other observed facts. You didn't go to sleep until after the 3rd hour. How did you? He stopped. The maintenance corridor outside his quarters ran past the Veil-3 diplomatic wing. You were awake. I don't sleep well in new places, she said without embarrassment. My mother says it's a feature, not a problem. I say it depends on the place. She held up the data tablet. I have been reading about the trade disputes. He looked at the tablet. It had a lot of text on it. He had the feeling it had significantly more text on it than it had had the night before. Laren, he said, how old are you? In your years, approximately 12, she said. Why? No reason, he said. Walk with me to breakfast. She fell into step beside him. Her diplomatic escort trailed at a careful distance, communicating to each other in the low, resigned tones of people who had accepted their assignment. Her markings were doing something steady, and even that he'd come to understand in 3 days as her baseline thinking state, not calm, exactly, but organized. Everything moving in the same direction. The dispute about navigational rights in Sector 47, she said. It's not really about navigation. No, he agreed. It's about the Haveth Station incident, she said. 12 years ago, a human ship entered Veil-3 adjacent space without filing the standard approach notification, and there was a weapons response and 3 people died. The human coalition says it was a navigational error. The Veil-3 say it was a test of our response thresholds. She paused. It was a navigational error. I have read the logs. But the Veil-3 Council has never accepted that explanation, and they are not going to accept a navigational rights framework that doesn't address the underlying question of whether it was intentional. He stopped walking. She walked 2 more steps before she noticed and stopped as well, looking back at him. Your mother told you that, he said. My mother did not tell me that, she said. My mother is very careful about what she tells me regarding active disputes. I read the council records from 12 years ago. They are classified, but I have clearance. She said this without particular pride, just as a statement of access levels. The council voted 5-3 that it was intentional. The Queen voted that it was not. She was overruled. He processed this. The Queen had been overruled by her own council on an incident that was still, 12 years later, the foundation of every major navigational dispute between their civilizations. She had believed the humans. She had been outvoted. She didn't mention that, he said. She wouldn't, Laren said. It is not hers to mention. It is the Council's position, and she represents the Council's position. She tilted her head, 4 eyes steady. But she could have chosen a different framework for this summit. She chose the one where the files are accessible to anyone with the right clearance. The Haveth logs are in the summit documentation package. I think she wanted someone to read them. He thought about a woman who had believed the humans and been outvoted, and who had spent 12 years representing a position she didn't hold, and who had built a summit around documentation she hoped someone would find. He thought about Vorsethil, patience that learns, patience that waits until the moment when learning becomes possible. We need to put the Haveth incident on the table, he said. Yes, Laren said. In Session 2, before the navigational rights discussion, if it is acknowledged first, the rest is simpler. Your mother is going to have opinions about this coming from the human delegation. My mother, Laren said, with the certainty of someone who had been reading people for 12 years and was very good at it, will not object. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back, steady, evaluating, the same expression she'd had in the airlock, deciding what she thought of him, storing the conclusion. You're going to be terrifying when you're grown, he said. Her markings flickered amber, warm and fast. My mother says the same thing, she said. She says it like it is a problem. I do not think it is a problem. It's not, he agreed. It's a feature. Session 2 of the summit opened at 900 with the standard formal protocols, the display of flags and sovereignty markers, the translation team arranged in their seats, the 17 disputed items listed in order on the agenda board. Marcus sat at the human delegation's table next to Ambassador Solano, who had agreed to the approach the night before with the measured, precise enthusiasm of someone who had understood it might actually work. Across the table, the Veil 3 delegation was arranged in their formal hierarchy. The Queen sat at the center, flanked by her advisors. Her markings were geometric and steady, formal, controlled, the face she wore when representing the Council's positions rather than her own. Laren was not in the room. She was, Marcus had been told, in a separate observation room with appropriate supervision, watching the session on a feed. He had been told this very firmly by both the human and Veil 3 security teams, neither of whom trusted a 12-year-old with classified clearance to sit quietly during sensitive negotiations. He had agreed readily, which meant he was the only person in the room who knew she'd been sending him notes through the tablet since 8:30. Ambassador Solano opened by setting aside the agenda entirely. This produced a ripple of surprise around the table. Veil 3 diplomats communicated surprise with a brief stilling of their bioluminescent markings, a momentary pause in the light, like a held breath. Human diplomats, less subtly, sat up straighter and exchanged glances. Before we address the items on record, Solano said, the Human Coalition delegation would like to acknowledge the Haveth Station incident of 12 years ago. The stillness that followed was complete. She read the statement Marcus had drafted at 200 that morning, carefully worded, precise in its acknowledgement. The ship's navigation had been in error. The approach had been unauthorized. The loss of life was not an abstract count but 3 specific Veil 3 individuals whose names they read aloud, one at a time, and whose families the Coalition had never formally contacted. The Coalition had never contested the Veil 3 account of the incident. They had never confirmed it either. They had allowed it to become a procedural dispute about documentation standards rather than what it was. What it was, the statement said plainly, was a failure of communication that cost lives and built 12 years of mistrust, and the Human Coalition was not in a position to undo that, but was in a position to stop using the ambiguity about it as leverage. Marcus watched the Queen's face as the statement was read. Her markings didn't change. She sat with the precision of someone who had spent 11 years learning to sit like that, and he couldn't read the geometric patterns well enough to know what was happening underneath them. But he had learned in 4 days to read the thing that was not her markings. Her hands resting on the table were very still, not controlled still. Still the way something is still when it has been waiting to be still for a very long time and has finally found the right moment. The lead Veil 3 advisor began to respond. The Queen interrupted him, a brief word low that the translator didn't catch. He sat back. She spoke instead, and she spoke for 4 minutes in Veil 3, and when the translator rendered it, it was simpler than Marcus had expected and more complicated than he'd feared. The Veil 3 sovereignty acknowledged the human coalition statement. They would note the 3 names in their own formal record. They were prepared to set the Haveth incident on the table rather than beneath it, and to proceed with the understanding that proceeding honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable, was the only foundation that held. After that, the 17 disputes took 2.5 days. Not because they were simple, they weren't. There were arguments and stalls, and one session that ran until after midnight and produced 3 people crying and one Veil 3 diplomat putting his head down on the table in what the translator confirmed was not distress, but a Veil 3 expression of complete cognitive exhaustion that had no human equivalent. There were moments when Marcus thought it was going to fall apart, when the old mistrust came back up like something surfacing from deep water, cold and heavy. But the foundation held. On the 3rd afternoon, the 15th dispute was resolved, and the 16th, and then there was a dinner break and everyone came back slightly calmer and worked through the 17th in an hour that felt, by Summit standards, almost comfortable. The final signing ceremony was held on Observation Deck 7, with the planet below, which the protocol team had chosen for its visual symbolism, and which Marcus chose to appreciate as its own small irony. The deck where the klaxon had sounded, where he'd stood looking out the viewport and seen a small figure falling away from a shuttle in a ruined ceremonial gown. Laren was allowed to attend the signing ceremony. She stood between her mother and the lead Veil 3 advisor, wearing formal attire that was slightly too long for her. She'd grown 0.5 centimeter in the 5 days of the summit, which the Veil 3 physician confirmed was normal for adolescents under stimulating conditions, and which no one had thought to account for when the outfit was prepared. She had not mentioned the length. She stood straight and steady and did not trip, which Marcus suspected required more effort than anything else she'd done all week. After the ceremony, after the signing, after the formal photographs, after the reception with the small food items that no one species found entirely appetizing, but everyone managed to get through, Laren appeared at his side with the quiet purposefulness of a person who had been tracking his location all evening. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. "My posting rotation," he said. "I've been assigned to the Kepler corridor, 4 months." She processed this with 4 eyes and her steady assessment look. "The Kepler corridor has a significant Veil 3 merchant presence," she said. "I know. The navigational rights agreement that was signed today covers the Kepler corridor specifically." "I know. My mother's trade representative in the corridor is Minister Veen Reth Solaris. He is diligent, but he does not understand the human side especially well." A pause. "He would benefit from a counterpart who is familiar with both sides." He looked at her. She looked back. Her markings were the steady thinking pattern, organized and even, and underneath them a faint wash of amber that she was probably not fully aware of. "Laren," he said, "did you just lobby me on behalf of your mother?" "No," she said. "My mother has not asked me to do this. I am doing it because I think it is a correct assessment of the situation." A pause. "Also because I want to know how the Kepler Corridor Shuffleboard League ranks compared to the Station League. You said there was one." "There is," he said. "It's competitive." "Good," she said. "I like competition that is real." She looked at him with the 4-eyed steadiness he'd come to understand as her most genuine expression, Not the formal version, not the performed for adults version, but the version that meant she was thinking something true. "You jumped," she said. "Without a checklist, without knowing who I was. You just jumped." "Yeah," he said. "I have been thinking about that for 5 days," she said. "I have read about it. I have asked my mother about it. I have thought about it during sessions when I was supposed to be thinking about fisheries rights." Her markings ran a quick, warm sequence. "I still don't have a word for it, but I think," she paused, careful with whatever was coming, "I think it is the most important thing. The thing that is underneath all the other things. The thing that makes everything else possible." He thought about the 6 minutes on the meridian, about the klaxon, about the dark outside the break room window and the coffee maker that only worked on Tuesdays, about sitting with someone in comfortable silence and having a word for it, and about the things that happened before the words, in the space where choice lived before it became calculation. "I think you're right," he said. She nodded, filed that, turned it over once with whatever she used for intuition, which he was starting to understand was very good intuition even at 12, probably excellent intuition by the time she was 40. And then she extended her hand the way the briefing document said was a human formal gesture, palm down, fingers together. He shook it. Her markings did the full warm amber bloom from collarbone outward, slow and bright and completely undiplomatically visible, and she didn't try to suppress it. "Safe posting," she said, "Kepler corridor." "Keep winning at shuffleboard," he said. She smiled, a veil-3 smile, upper lip pulling back just slightly, secondary eyes narrowing in the expression the cultural briefing described as reserved for people you trusted, and walked back toward her mother's side of the room with her too long ceremonial robe trailing behind her and her head perfectly upright. Queen Siravel was waiting near the viewport with the kind of patience that had learned everything it needed to know. She watched her daughter cross the room and stood very straight, but not the diplomatic formal kind of straight, the kind that was just how you stood when something turned out the way you'd hoped. She looked across the room at Marcus. He looked back. She gave him a nod, small, precise, exactly as much as the situation called for. The Ron Vetha was in it. He knew that now. He'd looked it up the night before, the full cultural context, reading until the reference material felt real rather than catalogued. It meant, I see something rare, and I am not going to pretend I don't. He nodded back. Then her advisors closed around her, and the ceremony took over, and the room filled with the particular noise of diplomacy successfully concluded. Relieved, human and veil-3 voices mixing together in the observation bay that looked out over the planet, everyone talking at once, everyone suddenly remembering they had comms to send and colleagues to update, and all the administrative work that successful summits created in their wake. Marcus stood at the edge of it for a moment, deck 7. The same deck where it had started, where the klaxon had finally had something to say after 11 years of being ignored. He thought about the retrieval line, 300 meters of it, rated to 1,500 kilograms, clipped to his belt ring. He'd used maybe 60 of it. He'd thought, going out, that he hoped he wouldn't need more than half. He hadn't needed a fraction of it. He had a posting in the Kepler corridor. He had 4 months and a new assignment and a trade agreement that was going to require a significant amount of ongoing liaison work from someone who understood both sides. He had the name of a veil-3 minister who didn't understand the human side especially well. He had a 12-year-old who was going to be terrifying when she was grown, and who had filed him under something that didn't have a word yet, even in 2 languages. He thought that was enough to work with. More than enough. He picked up his bag from beside the wall where he'd stowed it before the ceremony. He checked his comm, a dozen messages, the expected administrative cascade of a concluded summit. And then, for no reason he could have articulated to anyone who asked, he walked to the nearest viewport and looked out at the planet below. It was beautiful from here. It was always beautiful from here. blue gold and enormous, wreathed in its slow weather systems, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the station above it. Planets were like that. They did their thing, gravity and atmosphere and the long, patient work of geological time. They didn't need to decide anything. They didn't need to calculate. He had decided. He had not calculated. The retrieval line was still somewhere in the equipment locker on this deck, coiled and rated and waiting. He turned away from the window and walked toward the docking bay, and the next thing, and whatever came after that. Behind him, on the observation deck where a klaxon had been silent for 11 years, the stars kept doing what stars did. They burned with the patient indifference of things that had never learned to be otherwise. They held their places. They did not need to decide. Everything that decided was in here. That, Marcus thought, catching the transit to the docking bay, straightening his collar out of habit, pulling up his assignment files on his comm, was the whole thing. That was humanity's oldest truth, the one that predated ships and stations and trade disputes and diplomatic summits and everything else. That you looked at the enormous, indifferent dark, and you jumped anyway. Not because calculation told you to. Because you were the kind of person who would. 3 days later, Laren beat him 11-7, challenged him to a rematch with the serene confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of losing, and spent 40 minutes afterward interrogating him about Earth's gravity, its bird species, its tradition of storytelling, and whether the mountain in the photograph on the break room wall was a real mountain or one that humans had made. "It's real," he told her. "Mountains that big we couldn't make." She thought about this. Her markings moved in the slow, considering pattern he was starting to recognize. "You could not make them," she said, "but could you climb them?" "Some people have," he said. "Takes a long time." "It's very cold." "And did they calculate," she said, "or did they do the other thing?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the steady, assessing attention of someone who was going to remember whatever he said and think about it for years. "Both," he said. "The good ones did both." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away next to something else she'd been thinking about. Then she set her shuffleboard disc on the line, took the careful measurement of the board with her secondary eyes, and sent it down the lane with a precision that suggested she had been calculating this particular shot since the moment she won the last game. The disc landed exactly where she wanted it. He watched it settle and thought that he was probably going to lose this rematch too, and that he didn't mind at all. Queen Siravel was waiting in the corridor outside the recreation hall. She had been waiting for some time, based on the posture of her diplomatic escort, who had the look of people who had stopped asking how much longer some time ago. When Marcus came out, she fell into step beside him without ceremony, which had become, in 3 days, their customary mode of moving through the station. "She won again," she said. "It was not a question." "She always wins," he said. "I'm starting to think the game was a trap." "She studies everything before she engages with it," the Queen said. "She spent 6 hours reading about shuffleboard before she asked you to teach her." He stopped walking. 6 hours. She wanted to understand it properly. A pause. She also spent 3 hours reading about humans. He thought about that. About a child who'd spent 3 hours reading about his species, who'd fallen into vacuum wearing ceremony instead of a pressure suit, who'd looked at him in an airlock and started immediately deciding what she thought of him. "What did she conclude?" he asked. The Queen walked a few more steps before she answered. When she stopped, they were at a corridor junction, the kind of nowhere in particular that stations had a lot of functional space, undecorated, the kind of place where the real conversations happened because nobody had bothered to put a camera in it. "She concluded," the Queen said, "that humans are the only species she has encountered in her reading who invented a word for the feeling of sitting with someone in comfortable silence." She paused. She found this remarkable. She asked me if the Veilthry had such a word. Do you? We have a word for it now, the Queen said. We borrowed it from your language. He looked at her. Her markings were moving in that water and weather pattern again. The one that wasn't rank, wasn't formal, wasn't any of the things the diplomatic files had prepared him for. Which word? He asked. She said it in standard, careful with each syllable, like something she had been practicing. Company. He was quiet for a moment. That'll do, he said. She looked at him with the expression he still didn't have a full name for, the one that was more than the diplomatic files had ever described and less than he had words for, and her markings ran the full Ron Vetha sequence, slow and clear and unmistakable. They stood in the corridor junction in comfortable silence for a little while. Nobody had put a camera there. Nobody was watching. The station hummed around them with the persistent, reliable sound of systems doing their jobs. Air recycling, gravity generators. The deep thrum of the engines that kept everything in position against the pull of everything else. He had jumped into the dark 3 days ago with a retrieval line and no checklist, and 3 minutes to work with. He thought, standing in that corridor, that he had not yet reached the end of the line. He didn't think he'd want to.